Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum at the Harvard Kennedy School. My name is Trey Grayson, and I'm the director of the Institute of Politics. And we're glad to have everybody here tonight for a great forum discussion. The forum tonight is going to be moderated by Harvard Kennedy School Professor Meghan O'Sullivan. Meghan was an IOP Fellow in 2007 and is currently the Jeane Kirkpatrick Professor of the Practice of International Affairs. So please join me in welcoming Meghan. She'll introduce the rest of the panel and moderate the forum.
Good evening, and thank you all for joining us here tonight. We have a wonderful event ahead of this next hour in 10 minutes or so. It's clearly a critical time in the Middle East. We saw the conclusion of potentially hopeful talks in Geneva with Iran yesterday. There's hope for cooperation between the U.S. and Russia on Syria, and there's great uncertainty as to Egypt's trajectory. And some would go further than just looking at countries individually, and they would say that the Middle East is actually in a period where we're seeing the arrangements of the post-Ottoman period collapsing. So how all this comes out, what the outcome of all of this is, has many implications for the United States, and in some cases constitutes vital interest for America's closest ally in the region, and that is Israel. And I dare say that a major predictor of success for policy and strategy in the region would be a joint U.S.-Israeli understanding of the problem, and where possible, an agreement among Israelis and Americans on how to move forward. For this reason, we've gathered this exceptional group of former policymakers and current-day thinkers and opinion makers to talk to us about the subject that we're looking at, which is America and Israel. Are they on the same page regarding regional challenges? And we have four great people to speak with us tonight. You have their bios, so I'll just introduce them briefly. To my immediate left is General Amos Yadlin, who is the current director of the Institute for National Security Studies in Tel Aviv and the former Chief of Defense Intelligence of the Israeli Defense Forces, and we welcome him. To his left, we have Michèle Flournoy, who is currently a senior advisor at the Boston Consulting Group, and until recently was the Undersecretary for Defense for Policy in the Obama administration. So we're happy to see you again, Michèle. We also, to Michelle's left, have Dan Meridor, who until very recently, earlier this year, was the Deputy Prime Minister and the Minister of Intelligence in Israel. We're glad to have you here. And he's currently chairman of the Jerusalem Foundation. And at the end, you'll recognize Bob Zoellick. It's good to have Bob here. He is a senior fellow at the Balfour Center, the former president of the World Bank, and the former Deputy Secretary of State of the United States. And just to state what I hope is obvious, these people all held very senior positions in their government, but they're here tonight speaking in their own personal capacities. So before I get down to business, I'd just like to thank a few people. First, I'd like to thank the organization sponsoring this program, and that is the Middle East Security Project, which I co-chair with my colleague Shai Feldman. We extend a warm welcome to our supporters who are here tonight for this event. And also our co-chair or co-sponsor is Tel Aviv's Institute for National Security Studies, and we have a very esteemed contingent of Israelis and Americans who are joining us for the next 2 days of private dialogue, and they're in the audience tonight, so I welcome them all. So let me start, Amos, if I could turn to you and ask you a broad, open-ended question, which is, give us a sense of the region from the Israeli perspective. How is Israel doing in that part of the world?
Yes. Some people say that...
It's a softball if there ever was one.
That a pessimist is an optimist with experience. Since I have at least 40 years of experience, I'm still an optimist. And from Israel, we are in the middle of a stormy ocean, but on quite quiet island. A friend of Dan, Minister of Defense, Barak, used to say, it's a villa in the jungle. I heard a term lately, it's a coffee shop in a slaughterhouse. So Israel is doing quite well. because it's a villa in the jungle, and the animals in the jungle are busy with themselves. It is today 40 years to Yom Kippur War. On the 17th of October 1973, I was a young fighter pilot flying over the Suez Canal. And out of the many sorties I did in this war, on the 17th was the only day that Egyptian missile was able to hit me. But don't be so tense. I landed safely.
You're still with us 40 years
and
later.
I'm still with you. And you know, in the Bible, in the book of Judges, after every crisis, and when the judge for the people of Israel solved the problem, there is a sentence saying, for those who understand Hebrew, "Vatishkot haaretz 40 shana," and the land will be silent for 40 years. And there was a huge argument after 1973. Who won the war? The Egyptians won it because they surprised us. They crossed the canal. The Israelis won it because they crossed back to the western part of it. How many airplanes were shot down? How many soldiers were killed? The balance was quite a tie. But if you look at it, and that's what your question, from 40 years, I think both sides won it, because we won peace, and we didn't have any conflict with Egypt for 40 years, and not with Syria, who was the other player in Yom Kippur War. So if you look from 2 generations, they haven't fought any war with Egypt and Syria, and this is a huge achievement for Israel and for the Middle East. Israel do have a very strong deterrence. Strong deterrence not only against states, but also against non-state actors. And not many professors here will testify that you can deter a non-state organization. Al-Qaeda cannot be deterred. But Israel won in the last decade 3 wars against terrorist organizations. We have destroyed the capabilities and the motivation of the terror from the West Bank. We haven't destroyed the capabilities of Hamas and Hezbollah, but we were able to deter them. So sitting in Jerusalem, it's a very dangerous situation, but the so-called Arab Spring and what is happening in the Middle East is not only threats to Israel. There are some opportunities there, and in a second round, I will be happy to speak about that.
Great, thank you. And thanks for starting us on a positive note, that the 40-year lens, which is so appropriate today, not only the anniversary of the Yom Kippur War, but also the start of the OPEC embargo, which has also been noted, but obviously in a much less somber way. Michèle, maybe I could turn to you and ask for an American perspective, looking at the region, and if you could, speaking in your own personal capacity, give us a sense of how the Obama administration is looking at the Middle East. Is there a regional strategy in place? Can we discern what the goals and aims are of the United States? How would the United States like to see the region evolve?
Well, let me start by saying I'm usually an optimist by nature, and it's rare that I'm more of a pessimist than you are, but Amos. But you know, when I look at the region, I see some very fundamental shifts and changes that I think are likely to take the next generation to play out. You see Arab publics fundamentally questioning the form of governance that they've accepted for many, many decades, and now asking for something more with a greater voice, greater participation. You see fundamental tensions between sectarian tensions, Sunni, Shia, now erupting into open violence and conflict. You see I think Iran seeking to not only acquire nuclear weapons with the potential that could foment further instability and a cascade of proliferation in the region, but also really playing a game where it is, consistently sponsoring terrorism, instability, proxy groups around the region, and so forth. You have many countries on the periphery of Syria now very much threatened by the instability and the potential for spillover, looking at Iraq, looking at Jordan, looking at Turkey, and so forth. So I hate to be the dark cloud after Amos's optimism, but I think the region is in deep turmoil, and it's likely to remain so for some period of time. That said, I think American interests in the region have remained quite stable. We still care about the free flow of oil and the stability of energy markets, even as we gain greater energy independence, because we care about the pricing of a global commodity. We care about the security of our ally Israel very deeply, and the security of core partners. We care about preventing further proliferation of WMD, and we'd like to even see it rolled back, as I think is starting to happen with chemical weapons in Syria. We care about preventing violent extremism from gaining a safe haven in the heart of the Middle East. So I think those interests have long been on the U.S. list and remain so today. But what's different now is, with this upheaval, with this turmoil, with these new dynamics, is America's leverage has changed. Our engagement is still needed, our leadership is still needed, but the game, how we use our influence necessarily is changing because of the very different circumstances on the ground. So let me stop there, and we can explore any of that.
Before I go to more specific country issue areas, Bob, might I give you a chance to jump in if you want to say anything from the economic perspective? Michelle mentioned the changing energy balance, and certainly that's something that's very different of the last couple of decades, but also the economic challenges that exist in many of the Arab societies that are in transition.
Well, I'd be happy to address that, but I was hoping to address your general point. Is that okay?
Yeah, of course.
Because as I was trying to reflect on what I think is some uncertainty about U.S. policy in the region, I thought there's 4 factors that contribute to this. One, if you reflect on President Obama's election, he ran as the anti-war candidate. This is how he beat Hillary Clinton. And he clearly wanted to get out of Iraq. He wants to get out of Afghanistan. If you look at the policies of Libya, Mali, Syria, and I think in this sense he's reflecting a national mood, is very, very wary about any use of force. So that leaves some ambiguity about the big question of Iran. Second, the administration then set out a statement of policy about pivot to the east. And I think, again, this reflects a feeling by the president and perhaps many others that there's been a lot of commitment to this region, there's a lot of frustration, perhaps a desire to perhaps have a little less engagement, but the reality is you can't detach. Third, I think when one looks overall about President Obama's inclinations, and again, I think in this sense he reflects some of the mood in the country, there's a frustration about well over a decade of fighting al-Qaeda and Islamic terrorism, because it involves things like military commissions, Guantanamo, things that are frustrating. But again, and I think the reality is when the administration tried to suggest that al-Qaeda was sort of at least very disabled, if not on its last legs, the reality has proven different. So this reality keeps intruding on this. And then the fourth is, it's very clear that the president has no particular association with the old order of the Middle East, but has he really engaged the new order sort of trying to break out? And I think if you put those 4 together, there's a little bit of uncertainty in the region about how to comprehend U.S. policy. In other words, this is not a policy of power and interests a la Henry Kissinger and Jim Baker. It's not the freedom agenda of George W. Bush. Maybe in a difficult environment like this, it's hard for good or ill to have a big strategy. So it tends to be a case-by-case policy coming up. But what I then think, in some ways you can see this with the Secretaries of State. Secretary of State Clinton basically tried to stay out of the region. She had Senator Mitchell with a sort of a not very effective effort. Secretary of State Kerry is putting himself in as the peacemaker in a very active role in the region, and the question is whether the president will support this. So it's a little bit hard for people to read in the region, and I guess what I would conclude is that in the Saudis and the Gulf countries now are probably saying, after whether fair or not, their sense of what the U.S. position was with Mubarak in Egypt, that if they get in trouble, they're not going to be able to rely on the United States. I think the European allies, insofar as they have a role, have seen an uncertainty about U.S., a little off-on, sort of sometimes connected, but sometimes not. For Israel, I think the reality is no U.S. president can detach from Israel's security, but there's a certain sort of, not ambiguity, but perhaps a lack of full association and engagement because of these other factors. It's just a little hard to read. And so I think one of the risks of this is that if you think about this in some ways, in a lot of ways, what the president's reflecting is a mood of the country, being tired of wars, being frustration with the Sunni Shia, being the sense that these are very difficult problems. But I think perhaps the missing part is that this is a region more than any other where power and the sense of power, and frankly a sense that the U.S. has to play a leadership role, even though everybody's going to criticize it, is fundamental going forward. So I think, without judging the individual policies, I think you have an environment where, from a U.S. perspective, people might say, well, we've got this position on X or Y or Z, but overall it's left a sense of uncertainty about the full degree of U.S. commitment. And part of that, again, is reflected that people are focusing on issues at home.
Mm-hmm. Before I move on, thanks, Bob, I'd like to give Dan the opportunity maybe to comment on what Bob said in this idea of an uncertainty about American engagement in the region, particularly from the Israeli perspective. He was saying perhaps there's I think you said a sense of a lack of full association. I wanted to give you a chance just to comment on that.
Well, first the caveat, we all have been wrong in the past predicting the future, especially in the Middle East.
Yes.
None of us sitting here, including me, could have told you 3 years ago that an Arab Spring is going to come, Egypt is going to be turned over, and all the rest that you see. So we need to be very cautious and modest when we try to say what the future is holding for us. So what I will say is my assessment, I may be wrong, as has been proven in the past. Second, I am fairly optimistic is the word that Israelis use today. It's a very unstable area now. Things are in the making, it's not over. But having said that, however, we have seen Egypt in a worse situation a year ago. Now what we see in Egypt is a regime fighting terrorists more than anybody, including Mubarak in the past. We've had Syria as a major enemy with chemical weapons. They may be dismantling them. Iran is a staunch enemy, is now under heavy pressure. I'll come to it in a minute. You see quiet in the land. Israeli economy is doing quite well. Stan Fisher is here. He can say it better than me. Over $30,000 per capita GDP. 6% unemployment, growth of rates still 3% and over. I think, modestly, I can say, looking at the turmoil around, I feel we are in a success story. Having said that, however, it's in a very volatile area. Iran. Phase 1 is over. Iranians lost phase 1. We, Obama and the rest, won it. They came to negotiate, they changed the disc they played. They play a different disc now, they have different music. It's not over. It's the intermission in the game. second half is more important, but it's not that we lost it. We came to a point we wanted them to come, to start talking. Will we be smart enough? I mean, Israel has a little to play here, America mainly, be focusing on the target and saying, you want sanctions off? Great. All of them off, but you need to stop the program, and the details will follow. We may be going there. It's not over, but I'm not pessimistic about it. If we do it right, we together, I think it can be reached. The problem that I see is an illusion that some Israelis may have and some others. We have an anomaly in the relationship with Palestinians that goes for 47 years now, since the 6 Days War. It looks quiet. It cannot continue. We need to change it. We need to find another arrangement. Two-state solution is what we all speak of. It may or may not be reached. It depends on both sides. For me, the Israelis have to set a target for ourselves, with or without an agreement, to try to create a border for us and offer them a real opportunity. I'm not sure we're doing that well enough. So America has an important role here, of course. And it's not that America did not show force and use force, maybe the opposite. There was a very significant show of force by America with Iraq, with Afghanistan. When you use a lot of force, the first reaction is shock and awe, how great you are. The second is that all you can do? We got it. So the limits of your power is seen as well. So America's after that exercise by Bush and then Obama. If America is seen the way that you described here, it's problematic. Not that much for us. We are in that camp. For many Arabs, and for us, I'll end with that, a strong America is crucial. Not only because we are allies, because this is the power that will have a way with our neighbors, enemies, friends, and we need America to show the strength that it can show for America and for us. So I'm not pessimistic. If we do it right, we can do it better.
Great. Well, let's drill down on some of the issues that you introduced into the conversation. And Michèle, we'll start with Iran. And certainly from an American's perspective, you see a change, I don't know, as Dan said, in the mood music, but certainly since President Rouhani has been elected, there's been a little bit of shift, at least in the atmospherics. Can you talk about how you think that's affected American policy and attitude towards the negotiations, and maybe anticipate where you think the U.S. and Israel could disagree if and when serious negotiations get underway?
So if you go back to the original objective, the objective has always been to get Iran to come back into compliance with its obligations under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And I think the Obama administration from the beginning sort of offered both a negotiation opportunity. Iran did not walk through that door seriously before, and so pressure was applied. Tremendous historic effort to put together an international coalition to impose sanctions that have really had real impact on Iran's economy, valuing its currency, affecting its economic activity, increasing unemployment, and so forth. And at the same time, backing that up with military preparedness and planning and posture to ensure that all options are on the table, including the potential use of force to prevent Iran's acquisition of nuclear weapons. So that was the stage that was set, and I think what the change that you've seen embodied by Rouhani coming to the table is a result of that effective pressure campaign. And it's very clear that Iran's objective is to get relief from sanctions. That's what they're at the table for. The question is, what do we get in return for that? And my own view is that we have to press for a truly comprehensive, definitive deal that deals with the nuclear program in a very clear, verifiable way before we get to the point of significant sanctions relief. My own view of this, again, I am now out of government, but my involvement in the early days of the formulation of our Iran policy is I think the president and the administration is extremely clear-eyed about Iran, about how they come to the negotiating table, about what needs to be done. I do think that it's very important to the U.S.-Israeli relationship that we have very intensive consultations, that we try to get on the same page about what are the objectives with regard to enrichment, what are the objectives with regard to verification and so forth, that we stay, as close as possible in terms of setting the terms for what is an adequate and comprehensive deal.
Great. Amos, certainly we've heard from Prime Minister Netanyahu, who has called Rouhani a wolf in sheep's clothing, wanted to get that right, that maybe there's a different, at least initial perception on the Israeli side. And does Israel have the luxury of being in a different place than the United States on this issue? Or does there have to be some kind of convergence? And to ask you a very specific question, is the demand for no enrichment, is that viable? Is that feasible, you think, in the current context of the negotiations? And is that something Israel will stick to?
Yeah, I think what's really important is what kind of agreement will be achieved at the end. At the end. And we have to be on the same page on what is a good deal and what is a bad deal.
Right.
So the fact that Rouhani was elected belonged to my optimism. Morsi was outset, chemical weapon is going out. Rouhani was elected. He is not a liberal. He is not Gorbachev. He is not somebody who is going to change the regime. All the liberals and the reformists are in jail. And if they are lucky, they are in house arrest. Mm-hmm. But he is part of the regime. But the people of Iran gave us a signal, gave the regime a signal that they want a change. So I don't know whether he is a wolf or a sheep or whatever. I am highly recommend to test it, to test it. And the devil is in the details of the agreement. I'm not impressed from the smiling. I'm not impressed from the wording. I'm not impressed from their willingness to negotiate, because I know that this is the consequences of the sanctions. And I'm very happy that the sanctions finally bite strongly enough that they will come to negotiate. I want very carefully to see what kind of agreement is achieved, because we are in a way in a win-win-lose situation. One win is a good deal that will stop Iran from achieving a nuclear weapon. The second win is exposing that Iran is cheating again and give more legitimacy to another options. The lose is a bad agreement. So you may ask me how you measure a good or a bad agreement. And I cannot realistically think that we can achieve all the parameters that not Bibi Netanyahu demanding, the U.S. Security Council demanding zero enrichment. But I really think that what we have to see is whether the Iranian clock is going backward 2 years, at least. So if they violate the agreement, and they will, at least you have 2 years to react. Because the same name, Rouhani, was the one who reached an agreement with the Europeans in 2003. When there was an efficient leverage vis-a-vis the Iranians. At that time, the Bush administration moves in the Middle East looked like very threatening to the Iranians. You were on the western border in Afghanistan, what seems in 2002 to be a very successful campaign. Another very successful campaign seems to happen in Iraq. The Iranians who fought with the Iraqis 8 years and were unable to cope with them saw how your military outset Saddam Hussein and destroy his military in 8 weeks. So they were willing to sign an agreement, or to reach an agreement. Unfortunately, in 2005, they understood that the situation is not anymore threatening for them, so they renew conversion, enrichment, and so on and so forth. So I will look at the parameters that will leave the Iranians with a minimum capability and the right to enrich. I don't have no problem with the right to enrich as long as there is a very efficient supervision. And if they send away the IAEA, it takes them 2 years to come where they are now. This will be my criteria for a good or better deal.
Okay, interesting. We have so many issues in so little time, so forgive me if we moving back and forth, and I know we'll have many questions from the audience, and hopefully people can pick up on these issues. Bob, I'd like to move to Syria, and you had commented on U.S. policy broadly in the region. If you could say a little bit about U.S. policy towards Syria today, is it fair to say that we have traded a very broad objective of seeing Assad out of power for a very narrow objective, not insignificant, but much more narrow, of getting rid of Syria's chemical weapons, even at the expense of consolidating Assad in his position for the foreseeable future?
Yes.
All right, I wanted pithy, that's pithy.
But let me expand on it. Look, this is a very, I mean, everybody understands this is an extremely difficult situation and problem. There's no easy solution on this. And removing the chemical weapons in a substantial way, maybe that's important for the security of the region. But recall the template where I was trying to start, which was in this region, most of all, sort of the raw sense of power. And out of this, what I would see is that Assad is further legitimated, and this is the man who was supposed to be totally removed. The so-called moderate forces have been weakened. The al-Qaeda and their derivatives basically have been strengthened and say that you can't rely on the U.S. and the West. I suppose in a general way, Hezbollah and Iran, who've been supporters of Assad, have been strengthened. Russia's been strengthened. Now, that isn't the end game of the process, but in a world that, in a region in particular that looks at the power, I'm a little troubled by sort of the spin that this is a great success of diplomacy. I mean, relative to where it was and other things, okay, fine. But and then the next step, of course, would be if a chemical weapon accord could lead to a broader peace accord. And I compliment Secretary Kerry for trying to do this. But as I look at the raw facts on the ground, even if the Russians and the United States reach some agreement, how are you going to stop those forces from wanting to kill each other? How are you going to stop the al-Qaeda forces? They're not going to accept any agreement. So what it strikes me is that at a minimum, I mean, in some ways, this goes back to Henry Kissinger's adage, it's too bad both sides can't lose. And I think that what that would mean for the U.S. going forward is that if we want to have some influence in this process, whichever course it takes, we better be investing in trying to find and strengthen those forces that we can live with. And I'm not on the inside, but it strikes me not enough has been done on that. So that doesn't necessarily say the U.S. has to get in and do it itself, and I think that would not be the mood of the country and others. But I worry that the end result of that series of events is one that the United States' hand has been somewhat weaker, and the opponents are somewhat stronger, but you've got further stages to play.
Thanks. Dan, staying with Syria, for some time, our Israeli friends and interlocutors have given some of us the impression that Israel would be happy for Syria to have Syria's civil war to just kind of play itself out. And my question to you, has this changed because of the use of chemical weapons in August? And what would Israel counsel the U.S. to do in this current situation? Would it be much different from what Bob suggested? Or would Israel be against any kind of greater intervention at this juncture?
Well, I don't think that we can advise the United States. I'm not sure we know what to advise the United States. Even if they were ready to use force in Syria, which they are not. But from our perspective, if the Assad regime had fallen, it would be a major blow dealt to this axis of evil, so to speak, between Tehran and Damascus and Hezbollah. And if you look at the region and the destabilizing power of Iran and its allies, it would have been a very important move. But one has to say immediately, one doesn't know, I don't know, what would have been the alternative. The idea that there is an opposition to Assad was wrong. There's no opposition. There are oppositions in the plural, many of them. And I tend to believe, although I don't know what went in the corridors in the White House, that the reason for the Americans not moving in spite of the chemical weapons used, is that they didn't know what the alternative would be, even if Assad fell. And I must say it's an open question. If Assad fell, what would we have in Syria? Another dictator, a failed state disintegrating to sectarian groups, Al-Qaeda, I don't know. I have to say it's not an easy question at all. But I think that the role of America was described very well by Bob, I think. And I want to connect something that he said to what Amos said about the test to Iran in a way. I have another test on top of the one that Amos put in. If there is an agreement that the Saudis think is not true, they will develop a bomb. It's not enough, or buy one. It's not enough to convince us or do something to tell us, be quiet, it's all right, we are friends, we'll defend you. There are players in the region that would not have an Iranian nuclear military power, and they would go for their own nuclear power, and there's enough money and other ways to get nuclear weapons in the Middle East. And this is a great danger. So one needs to think not only of how the Israeli government would be persuaded, the Israeli people, the other players, the Arab moderates, so to speak, some of them say it. If Iran gets nuclear, we get nuclear. So this is another test. Don't go for an agreement that will satisfy some people here, or maybe even in Jerusalem, but will not satisfy the Arab, Saudis, Turks, Egyptians, and others. A very important role. Now, Syria, I don't know what the end result. No doubt Assad got some time now. He was seen as on the verge of falling. But I want to add the element that was mentioned is Russia. Russia, with very few cards, play the game here. They put their foot in the door both on Iran and on Syria, not allowing the others in the world, led by America, get their way to the Security Council and sanctions against Iran or on Syria. And I have to say that this axis that was seen falling, helping Assad to survive, Hezbollah and Iran in real fighters and money and advice and intelligence and whatnot, and Russia from behind, they gained something here. Will the Russians be a new player trying to do something with the Americans? Will be this a new model for the world? Or is it something different? I don't know. But Russia should be looked at very carefully because they have stepped in. They were out, they've stepped in. Is it for better, for worse? I don't know yet.
Great. I'm going to try to squeeze two more questions in before we have people ask questions from the audience. Amos, I'd like to turn to Egypt. And as you are well aware, the Obama administration recently made a decision to suspend most assistance to Egypt. And from an Israeli perspective, does Israel feel that this move has jeopardized your security interests? And are you confident in the distinction between aid that Egypt needs to fight terrorism in the Sinai versus broader military assistance? Is that a meaningful one to make?
Once again, I recommend not to panic from anything.
That's a good.
Israel is strong enough if the U.S. will decide A or B about Egypt. And the Egyptian-Israeli peace process has its own legs. It's not because of America assistant Egypt. It's because of the very interest of the two countries not to go to war anymore. Even Morsi understood it. So I don't see any connection between cutting the aid to Egypt to the security of Israel. However, I must say, if we discuss Egypt, that in Israel, we see the events of the summer in a different perspective than the Obama administration. We think that this is a positive move. This is the renewing of the original Tahrir Square revolution, because Tahrir Square revolution was hijacked by the Muslim Brotherhood. And I don't have in this school to remind you that democracy is not only election. Democracy is much more than election. It's a fair constitution. it's human rights, it's women's rights, it's freedom of speech, it's a lot of things that Morsi ignored. And for many of us, it's remind places in the world, maybe in the 1930s, maybe in the 1970s, of one man, one vote, one time. So the fact that the military left its alliance with the Muslim Brotherhood, made a new alliance with two important elements in the Egyptian society, the people of Tahrir, the young, liberal, secular people that initiate the whole revolution, and the 40 million Egyptians that most of them are even illiterate. But they understood that the Muslim Brotherhood are not delivering. And they went to the streets in millions, more millions that vote for Morsi. So we don't see it as a military coup. We see it as a positive development for Egypt, for the Middle East, and in a way for Israel, because once again, they are fighting against the terrorists in Sinai in a way that they were never done before, not even in the Mubarak era.
Okay, I'd like to encourage people to come to the microphones. I'm going to ask Michèle one last question, and then I'll turn it over to the audience. So please start to make your way. I'm sorry not to be able to drill down on that answer even further, but and Michèle, I'd like to give you the opportunity to be the person who comments on Secretary Kerry's energies and efforts to bring the Israelis and the Palestinians to the table. Certainly this has been an enormous effort on his part, absorbed a lot of his energy, and I would like your thoughts on whether this is a wise use of American power at this time, and what's the opportunity cost of it?
I personally think that it's very important for the United States to be spending political capital on the peace process for a couple of reasons. First, if you think about what will ultimately lead to sustain Israeli security long term, it is a two-state solution that locks in Israel's right to be a Jewish democratic state. Given the demographics within Israel, in the region, and so forth, I mean, this is something that has to be pursued with some urgency. It is critical to the long-term security of Israel. So I think there's a strong argument there. The other thing is, I think when the United States is not seen to be playing a leadership role in the peace process, that is fodder for a narrative that the Al-Qaedas of the world, the violent extremists of the world, use to sort of fan the flames of radicalism, of anti-Americanism, of anti-Israeli sentiment, and so forth. So I do think it's an important effort, and so I would personally applaud Secretary Kerry for pursuing it. It can't be pursued to the exclusion of everything else we have to worry about in the region or the world, but I think it's an important effort, and I think it hopefully will incentivize and also put some pressure on the parties to come to the table and have more serious and productive discussions.
Okay, Bob, you want to just get
I
a
know
small
you want to go
word
to
in?
the floor, but I want to draw two points from what Amos said that kind of highlight, I think, maybe some lessons of diplomacy. So first on Egypt. If it were up to me, Morsi would have stayed around longer, and he then would have shown that he couldn't govern the country, and it would be more likely that it would prevent a martyrdom for a future generation. Okay? But the world didn't turn out that way. And so what I am really troubled by with the administration sort of removing some of the money is, at a point you have to decide. This is an example of what I'm saying about uncertainty. Where do they really stand? So on and so forth. Right now, whether Sisi and the military did exactly what you wanted or not, they feel their lives are on the line. They're not going to play on the edges here. They're going to make sure that the people that they're worried could hang and kill them are taken care of for now. And it strikes me that the U.S. has to decide. We may not like this, but we have to decide, are we going to back the military and use our full support for the military to push them to the next stage? whether it's the constitutional process, Sisi not running. I do think, I'm not an expert on this, but there may be some possibilities to become more inclusive because the Muslim Brotherhood is sort of splintered. There will be other stages. But instead, what does the U.S. do? It takes a position that loses some of its standing with the military, and with the Muslim Brotherhood thinks that we're part of it anyway. So how does this enhance our power going forward? Now, it's appealing at home. You can say, well, I took a little bit here, so on and so forth. But my point about diplomacy is it's not just what you say in the papers and the spin. It's how you drive this forward and use your power. And the second point, this Iranian negotiation, again, here's where the trick is going to be. Everybody in this room probably knows diplomatic negotiations start to take on a life of their own, okay? And given where the Iranians were, they're going to be moving a lot, okay? And they've got all this nice mood music and so on and so forth. What I think is critical at this stage, because the United States is negotiating as part of a coalition, is to define with the coalition the conditions that meet what Amos said, which is we're never going to be sure what the Iranians are going to do, but we can have a pretty good idea that we'll set it back so that it would take a year or two to be able to go forward. We need to clarify that now, up front, very straightforward. And I'm not even saying this with the idea that, oh, you have to be ready to use force. I would even say, even if you're not ready to use force, what you then will do is keep on very tough sanctions, okay? But these are both sort of incidents of diplomacy, and I'm somewhat worried when I watch this dynamic, because I've been part of these. Where this will go, oh, they're close, we'll do this, so on and so forth. This is one where the threshold is quite important. And so this is the risk a little bit of the uncertainties of this sort of case-by-case polity and the lack of clarity of the U.S. position.
Great, thank you. Let me move to the audience and start on the left. I think everyone in the room knows the rules. All questioners, please identify yourself. Please ask a question that ends with a question mark, and that's the third one. So I'll start with you.
Hi, my name is Nancy. I'm a freshman at the college. My question is, a recent New York Times article entitled Two-State Illusion suggested that the two-state solution was something that diplomats clung to because to do otherwise would mean that they weren't being diplomatic, basically out of a fear of perception. Recently, a Pew study showed that 48% of Jewish Americans don't believe that Israel is doing all it can to ensure peace between Israel and Palestine. My question to the panel is, to what extent do you think that the U.S.-Israeli relationship can begin to imagine a one-state integrated solution?
Dan, can I field that to you?
Yeah, well, I think that if it's not a question of Israeli security, it's a question
sorry,
of Israeli
Israeli what?
identity. It's not security, it's the identity of the state of Israel. 47 years ago, after the 6 Days War, a justified war that we won quite dramatically, nobody could have thought that what we'll have after that will continue 47 years. You could have been for annexation and giving full rights to everybody. You could have been for withdrawal. But leaving uncertain, unclear situation for people not to know whether they belong here or there, they don't vote, is something that is not perpetuable, cannot continue. It's bad for us. It's so bad for us that I think that we need to try to change it, even if we can't have an agreement with the other side. I have to say, Israeli government may be under criticism. I myself criticized part of it, but I have to say, honestly, the previous government, the good government, previous government of Mr. Olmert, tried everything in the book. Udi Dekel sitting here could testify to that, to reach an agreement, offering everything, and they were rejected, in fact, by Abu Mazen. So I'm not sure there is an agreement, even if you want. Only think of that. He doesn't control half of the game. Gaza is out of his reach. We speak of demilitarized state. Can he take one of the missiles, the 10,000 missiles of Gaza, and drop it in the sea? Nobody will listen to him. So is there an agreement? I'm not sure. I think we should go for this, but I think that our goal should not be an agreement, and that's it. Our goal should be to create a border for Israel. Even if we can't do it fully, there are a lot of things we can do now, like stop all settlement activity on the other side of the blocks of the fence, or the green line, the fence. Like giving more and more authority to Palestinian authority on the other side, even in Area C. And other things that can be done even now, even without an agreement. I would not take the army out, the minimal army that I need, because I saw what happened in Gaza. I wouldn't repeat it. So there are things we can do. If we say, are there agreement or nothing, there may be nothing. So we need to do it now. One-state solution is a possibility, but it will not be what we dreamt of. It will be a binational state, 55% Jews, 45% Arabs, something like that. We are a majority, unlike South Africa or things of that sort, totally different. We are still a majority, but it's not a nation state. And looking at the hatred and the fear on both sides developing in the last 47 or 60 years, I don't think it will work. So I think it's the logic that 70% of Israelis see and speak in every poll, and everybody in the world knows that if there is an agreement, it is a two-state solution. It's not easy, it's full of risks. We need to try to go that way, either with an agreement or try to bring it as close as possible, even without an agreement.
Thank you. Up in the galleys, I guess.
Yes, hi, I'm Jenny. I'm a freshman at the college. And I wanted to ask about the ultra-Orthodox community in Israel. It's a population that's growing faster even than other populations in Israel. And it's also a population that largely doesn't sort of recognize Israel as a state that should exist. And I was wondering if you saw any security threats coming from that population, and if there are any also specific examples of the way in which they might pose a threat.
Amos, how about that one for you?
No, I hope I understood what you asked, because I can't see you. It's like an inquiry in when you are in prison. Assuming that you ask that, are we worried from the Orthodox population of Israel? We are not. Unlike the conventional wisdom, the Israeli public is not become more religious or more going to the right. The last election show everybody that it's the opposite. The Israelis are moving to the center, the religious people are out of the government, and it's a secular government more than the previous one. Israel is a very pluralistic country with a lot of ideas. 2 Jews, 3 ideas. And 6 million Jews, 12 ideas, 12 million ideas. And people it's a vibrant, dynamic democracy that moving back and forth on many, many, many issues. Many issues. And the Orthodox have the rights to have their ideas, even within the Orthodox. You have settlers, which are very much to the right. You have Orthodox movements that are for peace. There are ultra-Orthodox that doesn't care about political issues. They care about religious issues. And they join a coalition that gives them more to their own needs. So I know that from time to time in this country, people try to describe Israel as going after the settlers, going after the extreme religious, going after the ultra-Orthodox. The core of the Israeli society is secular, very much in the center, and I'm not worried from an internal threat.
Great. Over to this gentleman.
Hello, my name is Wright. I'm also a freshman in the college.
There is only freshmen here?
You're just the fastest to the microphone, the youthful.
One of the kind of events in Congress that got less noticed with the debt ceiling kind of battle was a bipartisan group of lawmakers put out a statement saying that they opposed any change to the sanctions on Iran, and some called for more sanctions on Iran. And also, conversely, when President Rouhani returned from the United Nations, there were groups of hardliners that greeted him that were not at all pleased that he was even considering reopening negotiations. So even if the leadership in the United States, in Iran, is willing to come together and try and hash out an agreement, is an agreement that could satisfy their domestic constituencies possible? And if it is, what could the diplomats do to sell that agreement and to make it more palatable to more people?
Michelle, would you like to?
It's a great question. And I think there are challenges both in the United States and Iran in terms of delivering the domestic political consensus behind any agreement that is achieved. I think it's a much more manageable problem in the United States. I think if we get a good agreement, if it's an agreement particularly that Israel is comfortable with, that other friends in the region, the Saudis, UAE, and others are comfortable with, it's a good agreement that we can stand behind. I think our domestic we can form a consensus to support it. I think Rouhani's job is a lot tougher because I think there are elements in the Iran, not only in Iranian society, but particularly in the power elite, particularly the Republican Guard, hardline elements that really don't want to accept any real limits on the program whatsoever. And so I think the issue that you're raising is a much more serious one on the Iranian side. And we'll have to see how that plays out.
Yes.
Hi, I'm actually also a freshman. My name is Max. And I have a question probably more aimed at the two former American policymakers on the panel. Obviously, the United States and Israel have a very strong, very long-standing alliance. But I think there's no question that while the United States gets a lot of benefits from supporting Israel, there are also negative side effects. Probably one of the reasons that so many countries in the Middle East tend to dislike the United States is that we are strong allies with Israel. And so I'm wondering, when the United States, when the executive branch, for instance, makes its policy calculus, when it makes its decisions regarding Middle East policy, and specifically regarding Israel policy, to what extent do you think President Obama and President Bush actually consider both sides of the issues, that they consider all of the impacts that their Israel policy has?
Bob, how about you, since it's a...
I'll do the later period. Well, okay, I'll go first. The support for Israel is very bipartisan, very strong. As this question from your colleague freshman suggested, it's very strong in the Congress, which will sort of continue to press the administration. It also has strong societal roots. So one of the biggest changes over the past 20 or 30 years is the connections of Israel with the evangelical community. It wasn't always that way, And so for any administration, the real question will be where there's any difference, whether to take that difference and take the political hit at home, okay? So I was with Secretary Baker earlier this week, and he reminded me of two votes, one in the start of the Reagan administration with Saudi arms sales, AWACS, and then another one with the issue of loan guarantees, where the Reagan and Bush administration took a different position than Israel. Okay, and the reality is, and this has not escaped Presidents Clinton, Bush 43, or Obama, they paid a big political price, a very big political price for doing that. They succeeded, and that in some ways may have strengthened their overall diplomatic hand in terms of being able to say we'll take our own positions. But I think, by and large, for the reasons we've said, there's probably a 80 to 90% alignment on issues. As Amos was saying a little bit on Egypt, I think there's probably a slight difference. I will highlight this on the Iran issue. Because as the way Michelle defined it with the Congress, I would agree with her conclusion. But let's say there's a deal that doesn't quite fit what the message coming out of Israel or Saudi Arabia. I think that's a very real possibility, a very real possibility. I think this administration will try very, very hard to have a deal. And whether it's exactly the right deal is another question. And then the question from your colleague about the Congress is going to be really true. Because remember, when the president decided he wanted to take action against Syria, he didn't have the support in his own caucus. So this is one of the few times Boehner and Cantor, the speaker and the majority leader, actually offered support. And that tells you something, that just as you've got a populist right, you've got to move on the left here in the country that is it's less obvious because of President Obama taking all the oxygen. But on some of these issues of going to war, conflict, others, you don't necessarily have the same support that people might think is out there. But on this issue of Iran in particular, there are very deep held feelings in the Congress. So this is one where, in a way, as Michelle suggested, it'll practically keep their feet to the fire in the negotiation.
I know that Dan and Amos wanted to make a very brief intervention. I'll give you each just a few seconds to respond to that question before we continue moving around. Dan, I'll start with you.
Let me take issue with the assumption that America stands with Israel on everything. I think there are things where America was very much against Israel, and Israel changed its position. From 67, America said, you want to annex territories. If you do only minimal parts, it's 67 plus changes. This is 1969, Rogers said it. Israel said no, all governments. Now, 47 years later, Israel says more or less the same. America didn't stand with Israel on this. It does stand with Israel on things that relate to its survival. Nothing more than that. When the Palestinians were offered everything, they didn't take it, and they said right of return, America does stand with Israel. So I think there are other cases that were mentioned here where America and Israel did not agree. Not always America agreed with us. I remember being a member of government and serving governments that said no to America. Begin, Shamir, Rabin in his time had a big fight with the President Carter in the 70s. And it was not always an ideal situation. On the basic issues, and we are at the end of the road of the negotiation. Everything is already said and done. We come to the basic thing. Is Israel going to stay and survive or not? We don't have a clear answer from the Palestinians. On this, Israel and America stand together. Iran is not an Israeli issue alone. It is Israeli. It's a Saudi, Arab, it's American leadership. So there is conversion of interest. It's not that America has to give up on its own interest in the sake of Israel against other Arabs. Now you have most Arabs and Israel on one side and Syria and Iran on the other side. So it's not a black and white picture at all.
Almost briefly.
Once again, can I give you an advice? Don't always buy the excuse on the surface, because the Arabs use it against America. But if you look at the role of America in the Middle East, as Dan said, it was very balanced. It's brought peace to the Middle East. President Carter with Egypt, and President Clinton with Jordan, and the PLO Israeli agreement. It's all done with American help. And when you speak today with a Saudi general, which I see from time to time, they hardly mention. It's number 3 on their list. Number 1 is how America throw their ally, Mubarak, under the bus. Number 2 complaint is why America is doing nothing about Iran. And then they will always say the Israeli-Palestinian issues are not helping to help. They are not helping to solve. And we see Secretary Kerry invest so many of his time in this. So the argument is not coherent. And even if you look at September 11 announcement of bin Laden, why he flew the airplanes into the towers, Israel is not there. It's America stealing the oil from the Arabs in the Gulf. So it is important when you do analytical learning to distinguish between propaganda and facts.
Sir.
Good evening. I'm not a freshman.
But I see that you are in Israel.
Leo Brucker, I'm a Wexner Fellow here at the Kennedy School. I'm wondering what...
Could you just speak more directly into the microphone? There we go.
I'll try my best. I'm wondering what are the lessons, if any, that the administration is taking from his experience with North Korea to the negotiation table right now with Iran. Thank you.
Michelle, could I turn that to you?
Again, I can't speak for the administration, but I think that the North Korean experience, and particularly the experience of feeling like, watching successive administrations over time, you start to question how many times are we going to buy the same horse? How many times are we going to try to pay to get the same sort of limits on the system? When I say the administration's very clear-eyed about Iran, I think it's partly informed by the experience with North Korea, which is not just a U.S. experience, but it's a six-party talks experience, which has a lot of some overlap in terms of others who've learned similar lessons. So I do think it's a relevant case, and it's very much in the experience and in the mind of those who are going into these discussions. I differ with Bob in the sense that, yes, I think this administration would love a good deal. I don't think they're in a rush to get just any deal. I think everybody understands that once you start relieving sanctions, you're never going to get them back. So you better be very, very careful that you've got the right deal before you let up on the pressure. That's my reading of the administration.
Just to be clear, I didn't say any deal. I said a deal that would not give you the couple of years cushion that Amos mentioned. And there can be things that look appealing, but don't give you that cushion.
Yeah. Again, I think.
But we'll see.
Yeah. I think that same reluctance to be, to have to go into another war in the Middle East is actually a driver of ensuring that you have a deal that does really give you real warning, real time back on the clock, and the kind of assurances you need so that you don't have to be in the situation where wondering within 6 months is some kind of more decisive action going to have to be taken.
Up in the balcony, please.
Yes. Hi, I'm a graduate student at the Kennedy School, and we mentioned a couple of things so far, one being somebody talked about an internal threat, and then we also discussed the idea of the Jewish-Israeli state. So I was wondering, it's a two-part question, I guess. One is how much effort and actual emphasis should be on reconciling this internal threat, meaning that Israel is not at peace with its immediate neighbors, the Palestinians, versus we're talking about regional sort of stability, regional issues now. How much should Israel focus its efforts on that? The second part, and the crux of the issue is the idea of a Jewish and democratic state is an oxymoron. So I was wondering if you could comment on that, seeing as to how 20% of Israeli citizens are Palestinians and there are 35 laws that discriminate against them. Thanks.
Dan, over to you.
First, on the oxymoron, it doesn't exist, I think. The idea of nation states, many European nations are built this way, is an expression of what President Wilson spoke once of, national self-determination, right of nations. There's the Jews are a nation, they have a right of a state to a state. They don't have a state made only of Jews, they're about 20% of Arabs. It's the national expression of our self-determination and our minorities, and there should be full equality in everything. No discrepancy. You can be a Jewish state in the sense that it's the expression of our self-determination, and still it's a fully democratic state for everybody, the same. If there were no Jewish majority, it wouldn't be a state of the Jews, it would be something else. I don't see any contradiction here, I don't see any problem with that. Jewish, in that sense, doesn't mean religious, it's not a religious state at all. If Jews were only a religion that didn't deserve a state, there's no state given to religion, it's given to nations. This is the Zionist idea. We're a nation and we deserve a state, and we have minorities. We need to treat them equally, even with affirmative action for them, but I don't see contradiction. The other part is the region and the Palestinian-Israeli question. I don't think we should allow anyone to be contingent on the other. If we say we don't deal with the Palestinians unless everything is settled, we'll never settle anything. By the way, until Begin and Sadat had the agreement, this was the Arab idea. Don't deal separately. You give veto power to the extremists. If you get one and you settle it with him, great. We did it with Egypt, with Jordan, we tried with Syria, it didn't work. Other countries who were in good terms with us, not officially, but take Morocco, Tunisia, Gulf states, we need to try to help the region. We can't do much there, I have to admit. On the table, they won't do it with us openly, it's dangerous for them. We can take the opportunity of creating ad hoc coalitions, alliances under the table, so to speak, against the Iranian threat, and there's much more intimacy in the relationship, intelligence community relationship, with not one and not two Arab countries because of the threat that they see, And they know that we are there and we have the same interests. The Palestinians are a different story. In spite of the rhetoric, Amos said it, of the Arab countries, they don't do much about it. Never did. Not in money, not in any other thing. It's our interest. It's not for them, it's for us. And we need to try to promote it, whether the other Arabs agree or not. One thing I have to add, if there is any agreement or any change with the Palestinians, we need to take Jordan into account. For Jordan, it's a clear interest that what will be built there will spill over to Jordan. And we have this triangle of Jordan, Israel, and future Palestine that we need to find a framework for. We need to do everything in coordination with Jordan. It's a very important country, maybe the best ally we have in the region, very intimate in many ways, and their stability in future is our interest. So there is a connection, but we can't wait for one and not do anything with the other. The region is going through a major change. It was mentioned here. It's a battle of ideas between religious fanaticism and modern Western values. We saw it in Tahrir Square, we saw it in Tunisia, we saw it in all over the Muslim world. It's a huge battle. It's not over yet. We don't know how it's going to end, but we need to do with the Palestinians separately, regardless of everything else.
And I'm sorry we have to take our last question now. I apologize to those who have been waiting, and I'll take it up in the balcony there.
Good evening. My name is Yoav. I'm a freshman at the college. My question regards the Europeans. Frequently, they're viewed as the moderates when it comes to negotiations with Iran. Now, are the interests of the Europeans when it comes to negotiating with Iran any different from the interest of the United States? And if so, are the Europeans looking for a somewhat different agreement with the Iranians?
Bob, do you want to take that?
I think, and this goes back to the point that Amos and I are stressing, from a pure interest point of view, they should share an interest in not having Iran to have this capability. And therefore, it's very important, not only with the Europeans, but with the Russians and others, to talk about the dangers of not getting this right with the Saudis, the Turks, the region as a whole, because separate from interests, the politics, the society of Europe will want a deal. They will push at the margin to say, oh, the Iranians have done this, and these people are sounding good, and so on and so forth. So I think it's been quite successful. I compliment the Obama administration by putting together the coalition it has so far and holding them. It's been made easier because the Iranian counterpart has been so obdurate. Now you have a real challenge of diplomacy. So I don't think it's so much interest, but I think you better be ready for the society and politics of the diplomacy to say, oh, well, God, they've moved so far. Can't we meet them partway? That's what I'm trying to explain about this is a different negotiation. If it's trade, if it's buying a house, others, you can often split a difference. This one has a different nature to it, and people ought to appreciate that coming in. One other small point, because you asked about economics, something that didn't come up, but I do want to stress. I think there's a big opportunity for Israel to use its economic dynamism, and you mentioned Stan Fisher and others, to position itself a little bit beyond this region in the way that we've talked about. I mean, you actually, if you think about what's going on in sub-Saharan Africa with some of the growth and some of the needs, but also, frankly, some of the concerns about Islamic radicalism, I think that there's now a chance, and I hope the U.S. could actually support this, to help Israel be not only seen as the Jewish state, the security issue in the Middle East, but as an economic dynamo and as a source of technology and innovation. And I think this has got a lot of untapped potential. Israel's still a small country. It can't do it everywhere, but from lots of experience, from what I see on the economic side, there's a lot of interconnectivity here that Israel still hasn't leveraged that could help it in its overall diplomatic position.
And Amos, as our guest, I will give you the last word.
I just want to say that the Europeans, in a way, are with a better positions on Iran than the administration. And why? There is, I think, two reasons for that. One is the range of the Iranian missiles. As you are close to Iran, to the missiles with the nuclear bomb, you become more sensitive and care about. So the Saudis are the closest, then Israel, then the Europeans, and you are still out of the range of the Iranians, but not for long. They are working on ballistic missiles that will be intercontinental. So the Europeans are worried from a nuclear Iran. Second, unlike you, they are not going to be energy independent. And they know that nuclear Iran will be a nightmare to the energy sector. So they really, their position about nuclear Iran are more close to the Israeli positions than to the US positions.
With that, I am sorry, very sorry, that I have to bring this panel to an end. We've touched on so many issues, all of which deserve more than an hour and 10 minutes themselves.
That's why we have the weekend dialogue.
Exactly, exactly. So some of us are very lucky we'll get to spend the next 2 days together exploring these things further. But I'd like to ask you to please join me in thanking our panelists for a great discussion.